In a week that was marked by a rather important and significant confession, if you like, on camera. Anton Balasingham speaking to NDTV, saying that the LTTE regrets the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. And that's thrown up all sorts of interesting questions. Should India talk to the LTTE now or should it not? More importantly, should India get involved once again with Sri Lanka? After all, it's one of our closest neighbors. It's a country which has had lots of extremely close ties with India. There are some who feel that India has almost washed its hands off Sri Lanka. Is that sensible or is it not? Should India in general get involved with the affairs of its neighbors? That's the subject for discussion on The Big Fight this evening. Joining us, a special panel, Abhishek Singhvi joining us to tell us what the government actually thinks of all of this. Dr. C. Rajamohan, of course, a familiar face with all of us, feels that India has to play a role in the neighborhood. He is, of course, Strategic Affairs Editor of the Indian Express. And General Satish Nambiar, been very closely involved in Sri Lanka. He was an advisor, of course, to the Sri Lankan government at one point. And we are going to be hearing a range of voices also from Tamil Nadu over the course of the next 1 hour. But before we go any further, it's time to take a quick look at some of the news headlines. And the first punch is going to be delivered by Abhishek Singhvi. Abhishek, before I get you to say anything on what you think should or should not be done in Sri Lanka and with the rest of the neighbors, let's just pause for a minute to hear what Anton actually told NDTV just a short while back. In a sense, he says it was a monumental tragedy which the LTTE regrets. Let's just hear what Anton Balasingham said to NDTV.
As far as that event is concerned, I would say it is a great tragedy. A monumental historical tragedy for which we deeply regret. And we will call upon the government of India and the people of India to be magnanimous enough to put the past behind and to approach the ethnic question in a different perspective.
A monumental tragedy, Abhishek, which we regret. That's as close, of course, as the LTTE has ever come to a confession. He then calls on India and the people of India to be magnanimous. Is there any question of that?
Trust is not a matter which can be just bargained for. Trust has to be earned. I think the LTTE has done nothing in the last 1 month, in the last 1 year, in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years to earn that trust. It almost amounts, I don't want to use harsh words, it almost amounts to an insult to the intelligence of the Indian people. Just consider, you have to remember whom you are talking to, what you are talking about. The LTTE is an organization which is banned under our POTA of 2002. It is banned under the Foreign Terrorist Organizations Act of USA. It is banned or proscribed in Australia, Malaysia, Canada, etc. It has assassinated, apart from about hundreds of other people, more than 60 major people, including the sitting president of Sri Lanka, a former Prime Minister of India, a defense minister and an industries minister of Sri Lanka, several MPs, several Tamilians who are the slightest manner moderate in their cause, 4 mayors of Jaffna. The point I am making is only this, Vikram, and I'll than that. I am saying that yes, you have to talk to everyone and you have to talk of devolution and autonomy. But you have to draw 2 lines. One, a line where the sovereignty of a nation and secessionism cannot be talked about. And 2, you have to even talk about devolution and provincial autonomy if the party you're talking to shows that it's sincere and genuine. I'm afraid I don't see any indication of that sincerity or genuineness. It should not be a tactical ploy alone, which is what it reeks of at the moment, as far as Mr. Balasingham is concerned.
General Nambiar, having said that, India has and does speak to people who belong to terrorist organizations. They may not have assassinated a prime minister, but there are any number of militant organizations, terrorist groups whom we talk to. The prime minister calls them, invites them, we speak to them. Should there be an exception made in the case of the LTTE also now?
I don't think we need to make an exception at this point. I entirely endorse what Mr. Singhvi has said. And as far as talking to the LTTE is concerned, I think that should be contingent on them resuming the peace process or negotiations with the government of Sri Lanka. Once that happens, whether or not we should play a role is what we should be thinking about.
Calling on the people of India to be magnanimous now, forgetting what happened 15 years ago.
No, I don't think we should go by what Anton Balasingham says. The problem is not what the LTTE has said today, because much of it is actually a repetition of what Prabhakaran had said in 2002. The real problem is today in Delhi. Both the Congress government and the illustrious government that preceded it have pursued a policy of masterly inactivity in Sri Lanka for the last 6 years.
Okay.
That it's essentially a policy that is see no evil, turn your eyes away from the situation and outsource whatever limited interest Delhi should be following to Chennai. That both the governments, dependent on Tamil Party's support, have been unwilling to produce a coherent policy response to a fundamental change that is taking place in Sri Lanka.
We're now being joined by B. Raman, who's one of the country's top counter-terrorism experts, if I can call him that. Mr. Raman, the question of talking to the LTTE as a terrorist organization, is that the way you think we should go to bring these organizations onto the table, as might have happened with the Maoists in Nepal to some extent, or do you think it's a bad idea? Wait until the Sri Lankan government does it first.
I would like to say one thing. See, the Sri Lankan Tamils, they need the LTTE, but they need an LTTE without the present leadership. Because if the LTTE is not there, the Sinhalese will once again violate the basic rights of the Tamils of Sri Lanka. We have to work for an LTTE with a new leadership, with new policies, because there is no question of having business with the present LTTE, which is headed by people who are responsible for the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. It's totally against our law, it's totally against international law to negotiate with proved assassins. At the same time, LTTE is a reality. LTTE has defended the interests of the Sri Lankan Tamils. It has got motivated cadres. Unfortunately, we are not taking any action after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. I can understand it, to promote new thinking in the LTTE, to encourage the coming into prominence of a new leadership. Look what Israel did, what USA did. They said they will not negotiate PLO so long as the terrorists are in leadership position.
Mr. Raman, can I just interrupt you for a minute? In fact, you're setting in train an interesting new possible argument which could be made, which is that here you have the organization which is now almost confessed to murdering your former Prime Minister of India. There are some countries, including those that you've named, which would have gone after the organization in a more dramatic and a direct fashion, especially after there is proof that they were involved now.
Yes, no, there are various ways, but here lots of other factors are involved because of the likely impact in Tamil Nadu, etc. So the question of our directly going after the organization did not arise, but there are various other ways in which we could have weakened the organization and we could have encouraged the coming into being of a new leadership. For example, Abu Mazen in PLO, the moment he came into being, his policies are totally different from the policies of the past leadership. The rest of the world has had no problems in dealing with him. Similarly, we should not have any problems in dealing with an LTTE, provided a new leadership which makes a total break with the present leadership comes into picture.
But staying with the LTTE for a moment, we're now getting in a representative of many smaller parties, Tamil parties in Tamil Nadu, which do actually feel that India does need to speak to the LTTE. Let's just hear from one representative of them right now on the program.
It is crystal clear that Government of India can find proper solution for Sri Lankan ethnic issue. For the past 25 years, this issue going on without finding solutions. Government of India should intervene in this issue immediately, not militarily but diplomatically and politically. This is LTTE expectation. So Government of India should have dialogue with LTTE to settle the problem in between LTTE and Government of India. Then Government of India should intervene in the Sri Lankan ethnic issue. Government of India can only settle the problem and find the solution. Without, there is no other way. Even Norway or any other country involved in this issue, definitely it will not find the end. So we the Indians or Tamil people, more than 6 crore, we demand Government of India to intervene in this issue in the favor of Tamil people, to stop all genocide which is going on in Tamil Eelam nowadays. This is our demand.
All right. Again, Abhishek, the essential point which you heard from that was that you do talk to other groups.
there is a difference between India engaging itself on the issue and talking to the LTT. With the second part, I certainly don't agree. Remember, I must repeat, I'm not speaking for the government. I'm not the policy maker in the MEA. But I do speak for the Congress party, and I see no major divergence between the Congress party and the government on this issue. Certainly, India, it is not a foreign problem. It's a problem in India's backyard, and India has to engage constructively with a sense of cautious optimism, with a sense of certain precautionary optimism. But the engagement must be through the proper channels of the Sri Lankan government. India, for example, I'll just make two short points, can do a dual policy of exhorting, pushing, persuading, nudging the Sri Lankan government towards the maximum autonomy and provincial devolution. But at the same time, it has to give moral support, diplomatic support and international support to the Sri Lankan government wherever the sovereignty of Sri Lanka is involved. After all, we have enough terrorist problems in our country. We can't do hypocrisy by doing one thing in our backyard and elsewhere.
Ruling out talks with anybody is not a wise policy. I mean, all that he said about LTT is fine, everybody knows that. But the fact is that we are saying the same thing about Maoists in Nepal, but now we are talking to them. So the question is there a policy? Now, whether we should talk to the LTT is secondary to devising a larger policy to Sri Lanka. And there I would say we must talk to everyone. Look, if we don't do something in Sri Lanka, it's going to get back at you. Therefore, if you want to find a solution, you'll have to talk to all the parties that are involved, including the LTT.
We're coming back to the same point. You talk to
It's
Maoists in
important.
Nepal.
I think I'll just make three quick points on this. One is Antony Balasingham, I think, has managed to, it's a masterful stroke because he's managed to put the cat among the pigeons, literally, in the sense, even initiating this debate of whether or not we should be speaking to the LTT. The other aspect is that whatever dialogue we wish to initiate as a country, the government of India, must not take into, purely be premised on the fact that the LTT is the sole representative of the Tamils of Sri Lanka. There are others who represent the Tamils of Sri Lanka. So within that broader framework, yes, it should be, if and when the time arises.
Is there anybody else, is that part of the problem, that the LTT is seen as the single spokesperson of the Tamil?
No, the LTT claiming that, and the fact is on the ground
They've also killed most of the other people who could have claimed.
Absolutely, and I think the 2 points, I think engaging the LTT as part of a broader engagement with the Tamils of Sri Lanka, and I think that is an important thing. There is actually a problem today. You have Colonel Karuna in the east of Sri Lanka creating a set of issues. That's in fact one of the reasons you have a tension in the peace process. But the important thing is, look, Norway is talking to the LTT. There is a peace process we all endorse. In that peace process, engaging LTT is part of it. Therefore, look, talking to the LTT does not mean endorsing the LTT. That if India is interested in managing the situation in Sri Lanka, we must be prepared to talk to everyone, but define the terms and conditions under which you talk to
Answer
anyone.
that.
There is a small nuance here. Nobody can object to engaging, but I think there are very, very significant preconditions to that, which without satisfaction you cannot even engage the LTT. The first condition precedent must be a total invitation, acceptance and consensus that India talks to the LTT by the Sri Lankan government. We have nothing of that sort at the moment. We can't parachute into an LTT engagement without the principal party, Sri Lankan government, inviting us and accepting us as an interlocutor.
They invited Samara was here last week inviting the Indian government to play a larger role.
Two. I am not complete. They're all cumulative conditions. This is one condition. Secondly, there has to be a consensus at home on that. Certainly today there is no such consensus at home domestically in India on that. Thirdly, there has to be, thirdly,
Consensus is an
1 minute,
escape clause
Vikram.
because there will always be one Tamil party which says don't
Not
do this
one
or
Tamil
don't
party,
do
I'm
this.
sorry.
You can't
There is
premise national policy on
No,
consensus.
it's
You
not
don't
one
have a
Tamil party.
consensus.
There is no
Abhishek,
consensus.
you don't have a consensus on a nuclear deal.
There is no
You don't have a
consensus.
consensus on a nuclear deal.
No.
You don't have a consensus on a nuclear deal, you've still gone ahead. You
Nuclear
don't have a
deal-
consensus on a peace
nuclear
process in
deal-
Pakistan, you've gone ahead.
Nuclear deal is a positive step by the government, which the government feels it should take.
But I'm saying
The
that you don't
government-
necessarily hold yourself back because of the absence of
Not
consensus.
necessarily, but in this situation, having had a history of past conflict in Sri Lanka, these two conditions followed by a third condition, I think ultimately the LTT has to be willing to talk to India on a certain set of preconditions first. They cannot say that we will not budge from our demand for a separate sovereign state and yet come to the talking table.
While I agree with Mr. Singhvi insofar as directly talking to the LTT is concerned, I think we have to look at it within this, this reservation that we have, or hands off, We cannot have a hands-off policy towards Sri Lanka, towards Nepal, towards our immediate neighbors. It's too, whatever happens there has too serious an impact within our country.
All right.
So therefore it has to take that into account.
That's the point which I think we should now turn our attention to. All right, we've discussed the LTT, we've got all these voices in from Tamil Nadu who are saying that, look, you do need to talk to the LTT at some point or the other. You could debate that. But the broader issue which has been raised by both of you is that can India, in a sense, wash its hands off problems in the neighborhood?
Cannot.
Because we think they're inconvenient. We'll turn our attention to that when we come back in just a couple of minutes after this break. Dr. Rajmohan, here's India wanting to stake a place at the world high table. It wants to be a member of the Security Council, a permanent member of the Security Council. It wants to be a regional or a larger superpower without actually saying this. Can you actually do any of that without having to in some way take responsibility for what happens in your own neighborhood?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all these claims for UN Security Council membership, the kind of self-chest thumping that we are a great power in the world, will look ridiculous if you're not willing to do things in your own neighborhood. And all the things Mr. Singhvi listed out, the conditions, is actually an obfuscation for doing nothing. The policy of the two governments, the last two governments in India, has been a do-nothing policy on Sri Lanka because of a whole range of domestic political considerations. And I think that is the worst part, that you don't want to disturb, unruffle any feather in Tamil Nadu, therefore you don't want to do anything. Second aspect is that you have the defense minister of this country, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, says, no, we're not going to get involved. Look, that is a threat that you must keep alive. Even if you're not going to send your military in there, that's a position you should keep alive. And but let me finish. India signed a defense agreement with Sri Lanka because of pressure from the Tamil Nadu parties. The central government, both of the Congress and the BJP, have refused to implement an agreement which that is the pathetic situation in which Delhi is today.
All right, answer that. What you're saying is an excuse for doing nothing, and you cannot afford, at a time when India wants to be seen as a regional superpower, a global superpower, you can't afford to do nothing in your neighborhood.
You see, I'm a little amused because the very same commentators who may call this a policy of do nothing or obfuscation will be the first to criticize us viciously the moment you engage with the LTT directly and the next day a general is killed in Sri Lanka, the next day a bomb explodes in India and an assassination takes place in Sri Lanka. So why the hell did you get your fingers burnt? Haven't you learned a lesson?
Look,
so it's very easy. It's like the Panchtantra tale.
In a peace
whatever you do
which
will
you
be
are
criticized.
supporting. Look, EU has banned LTT as a terrorist organization. But Norway's representative officially talks to the LTT. Look, talking to the LTT is not endorsing LTT. If we want to solve the problem in Sri Lanka, you've got to talk to everyone involved.
Let me ask you a question. How would you like Norway to talk to the erstwhile militant Khalistani militants? How do you like Norway to talk to the erstwhile terrorists in India and other groups?
There is an official negotiation between the Sri
There is a
Lankan
sovereignty
government
concept.
and the LTT.
The Sri Lankan government is the primary
internationally
source of talking.
supported peace process unfolding there.
But the Sri Lankans have come to you and asked for help, haven't
They
they?
haven't. There's a difference between, there is a difference between the Sri Lankans coming to ask for help.
The central government to take a more active role in
Let
Sri
me be
Lanka.
clear. I am all for engaging Sri Lanka on the issue. I am all for not ignoring the
what
issue.
is Lanka
What I am
telling
objecting to is going directly to the table as India as a sovereign nation and talking to LTT across the table. The LTT has done nothing. No, of course, that's what the issue is. That's the issue.
The issue is that some state get involved.
When the foreign minister of Sri Lanka is here, he's telling us, please do something with the LTT so the process can move forward. That's what he's telling me.
Well, Abhishek, you were saying that in the last section also, that how can we not get involved? But the other question, Bharat, how far is this going to go? We're going to get ourselves, we have enough problems at home also, as some would argue. Why get involved in Sri Lanka? We've got enough militant groups out right here. The northeast is still in flames. Kashmir, the problems haven't died down. You have the Maoists in large parts of the country. And now you're going to take on Sri Lanka's headaches, which would be the counterpoint.
All this is fine, but there's no way you can escape involvement in this because the country is next to you. And to that extent, that brings in this broader picture. How can we not get involved in our neighborhood, immediate neighborhood? We cannot wait till we are dragged into it, kicking and screaming by the international community. We have a role to play which has been imposed on us by virtue of our size, our geostrategic location in the region, all that. It's imperative that we play. Now, I agree entirely that probably talking directly to the LTT doesn't make sense at this point.
That's all that I'm saying.
That is, I think, it's a well taken point. But if the government of Sri Lanka wishes us to be part of the process and the LTT joins that process, then we can very well include it as part of this bigger country.
And you wouldn't have a problem with that?
No, but the point is
No,
it has to be worked
wait a
out
minute,
at a
you're saying you
larger...
wouldn't have a problem with that. If there was a round table conference in
I
Sri
have
Lanka...
no problem with the fact that India must play a role in pushing the peace process between Sri Lanka and LTTE. That's radically different from saying that India should talk to LTTE. They're two different things, like chalk and cheese. Now, for doing that, there are several things we can do. We can build international consensus, we can give moral support, we can give diplomatic support, we can get them together, and at a later stage, perhaps directly talk to LTTE also. We are talking here and now. Somebody
you're not ruling
says,
that out?
talk to LTTE. I say no,
so you're
don't
not
go to the
ruling that
table.
out. You're not ruling that out at a later stage.
Of course not at a later stage. Suppose, for example, LTTE shows itself as a moratorium organization for 3 years without doing a terrorist act. It shows itself as good boys, and it shows that it's sincere.
Wait a minute. Now
Yes,
you're
of course we'll sit with them.
Abhishek, now you, of course, your conditions are slightly different. Those are not the conditions you laid down when
No,
talking to the
I'm
Nagas.
saying that the sincerity has to show through. Mr. Balasingham makes a
You
statement
talk
and
to
you want
General
India to go and
Musharraf.
talk to LTTE.
You talk to General Musharraf without him necessarily showing sincerity.
No, there's a difference. General Musharraf, despite the enemy status of Pakistan, represents a sovereign country, sir. How can you ignore this basic distinction?
All right.
Mr. Prabhakaran does not represent that.
All right.
Do you talk to the Myanmar rebels? Do you talk to the terrorists in Angola? Do you talk to the terrorists in Europe? There's a fundamental difference. You are
talk
mixing
to
up international law altogether.
You speak to the Maoists in Nepal?
No, Nepal talked to them first. When Nepal
Raja?
reached the stage,
Raja?
India was an interlocutor
I think-
through the office of
I
government of
think
Nepal.
Abhishek's
Not to the
current
Maoists
formulation
directly.
is better than his earlier formulation. But
I mean, the formulation has changed over the course
No,
of
but
the
I think the
time.
important thing is that, look, as General Nambia was saying, look, you're going to be involved irrespective of what the current politicians might say here, because the situation in Sri Lanka is going to explode. The question of time, some way or the other, we're going to be involved. Now, within that, if you say, look, why we want to get involved is also fairly clear. We want to preserve the unity of Sri Lanka and at the same time also defend the rights of the Tamil minorities. Now, within that framework, India will have to do something, and that something would involve, it's not a question Abhishek Singhvi is going to be sent as a special envoy to talk to the LTT. Your intelligence agencies have long record of
He
engaging them.
was almost licking his lips at the prospect. How could you
present-
do that to him?
No,
I
the
thought they
present-
were well-wished, well-intentioned towards
the
me.
present NSA, the National Security Advisor, was the IB director under Rajiv Gandhi. He dealt with LTT for a long time. So there are people in our system who have no LTT, who have dealt with LTT. The question is, what is our objective in Sri Lanka?
In fact, he makes
and
my
what
point.
we do with LTT depends on what
Now,
your objective
track
is.
to-
now one
just
second.
one
I'm going
sentence.
to ask you, I'm again trying to broaden this a little bit. Get involved in the neighborhood. Let's just broaden it from beyond the LTT, beyond Sri Lanka. How far are you going to take the process? There are some who would argue that Bangladesh is in a mess. There are lots of problems which are taking place in Bangladesh.
We've been there
Nepal, we've already been handling for some time, and the problems in Bangladesh could also come back into the country. What about Afghanistan? Should we start sending troops into Afghanistan? These are all basic questions which are now going to start confronting us. How far should India get involved? And how far should India get involved? What about Iraq then? What about Iran?
It's time we started thinking about this. I cannot see India keeping its hands off all this. As far as the immediate neighborhood is concerned, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, I mean, the ethnic affiliations.
So would you
which
send troops
demand
to
our
Afghanistan now?
involvement.
Would you
Sorry?
send troops to Afghanistan?
Well, that's a situation which the government of India will have to examine should it become
wait.
necessary. Personally, I think
It's a
if there
situation which is there
requirement,
right
we
here
should
and
be
now. It's a
prepared to.
situation here and now. You could be asked that question next week. We could
Well,
be
if
back
you are
here
asked
doing a
that
big fight
question,
2
we
weeks from now.
analyze it in what context we
Two
send
points
it.
very quickly. This is a very good question. The question is, I know this the government decides, not for him or me to decide. The question is, should, not would, should the government of India send troops to Afghanistan? I suppose the answer would be no. Should the government of India have sent troops to Iran and Iraq? The answer would have been no. But then yes, we should send troops to Sri
increased your
Lanka.
presence of our
No,
ITBP
we took a
to
policy
defend your own
decision,
economic
bipartisan
projects.
policy decision by political
It's already
parties not to
happening
send
that
troops.
You got more projects
And
out
secondly,
there, and to
second-
make sure nobody is going to kill
Again,
your people like
okay, so Rajan, no,
Surya
let-
You're already
let-
increasing
let
your
me complete my
presence.
point.
Try and figure it out. How far does this go?
Let me
Should
complete
you
my
send
point,
troops
just 1
into
minute.
Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Vikram,
next
just
time
let me
there's a
complete my
crisis?
point in 1
In
minute.
Afghanistan, if you want to play a larger role and defend your
So
economic
send troops
interests,
to
you might have-
Afghanistan.
yeah,
You're saying send troops to Afghanistan.
have
Well, that's not been the policy of the government of India, quite rightly. It's
his
not been the
question-
policy, well, he can certainly have his own opinion, but that's not been the policy or the consensus in India. And the second point, the previous point Mr. Raja Mohan made in a sense endorses my point. Nobody is objecting to subterranean or track 2 diplomacy. Everybody knows that every country has an intelligence agency, the IB. Everybody knows that in each country that intelligence agency
talk to the
may do
NDTV,
track
to
2.
the IB, talk
I
to
don't
other
know.
groups.
Neither you know nor I know. Most people in government don't know. That may or may not be happening. What he's giving example is different. We are talking of official engagement as a sovereign nation of India with the LTT. That's the only point I'm objecting to.
You're also, of course, redefining the
No,
debate
that
as
is
a
in
good
the realm
lawyer
of the
into a
unknown.
way which would
That's
suit
in
you
the
the
realm of
best.
the unknown. What track 2 diplomacy takes place or track 3 or track 4, nobody knows about.
There are two ways of not getting involved with the LTTE. One, of course, which is what we've been discussing, is talking to them, bringing them onto the table, engaging in them. There are a lot of other people who argue that when there is a terrorist organization that is hit out at your country, you should take them on in a way which the United States is doing right now, whether it is in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever, for what, rightly or wrongly, we're not going to get into that.
Yeah.
The Israelis have done it. Should India have done that with the LTTE till now? Should India do it today with the LTTE?
Any engagement should involve both an option of talking as well as punishing the deeds which are not acceptable. So I think of the idea of...
Should India have punished the LTTE earlier? Gone after them? We tried it with the IPK, it didn't always work. Did it, Mr. Nambiar?
No, it's a question of, what you mean by this punishment. I mean, after all, if you want to do something about it, you've got to have the information, you've got to have pinpoint capability to go and hit the target. So many other things come into it. And insofar
was the IPKF a failure? I mean, you had military troops out
certainly
there, you could have
IPKF was
taken
not
on
a
the LTTE
failure.
and wiped them out.
IPKF was not a failure in the sense of the military operation. Whether it was a well-considered decision or not is something we can talk about separately. But as far as the troops operating on the ground were concerned, I think to classify it as a failure would be very, very wrong. And that is not the way, in any case, this question of punishment is
Mr.
talked
Raman has
about.
opened a conditional engagement. That's what he's saying, that if they give up certain types of policies, India
Right.
should be prepared to engage.
But just staying on this particular aspect of it, that organization which is in a sense claiming that we did kill your Prime Minister.
Of course.
Would you go after them? No, then the question of a soft state comes back again.
No,
that should we have gone after them in a more aggressive fashion?
No,
Made sure that they were punished.
Going after them in hot pursuit is another thing. We may not do that for various reasons. We do not follow Israeli policies. And
The
everything.
other reasons
but the point
being
is today,
being
you are
Tamil
saying,
domestic opinion?
No, it's not that. India is followed different policies than Israel in these matters. We do not want to exacerbate a situation where you may get nothing by going after them, but you may get reprisals of an unnecessary kind. But that's very different from saying that today...
That sounds like a policy for being scared.
No, not scared at
That
all.
sounds sort of
Today you are
policy
talking here and now of talking to them while Indian law prohibits and proscribes the organization, while you have taken no steps to punish as you and you are going to the other extreme. Here and now, talk to them. Where is the question of talking? When Mr. Balasingham makes the statement, two things happen which you are forgetting. In the 2 days prior to his statement, they kill off and assassinate a big general in Sri Lanka. And 2 days after his statement, a nuance is given that we have not accepted responsibility for Rajiv Gandhi's assassination also. We meant this and we meant that. And
No,
you
I
want to
think-
talk to this organization.
I think
It's an insult to India, it's an insult to the Indian army.
I think what I'm really saying is that there could be arguments that going in both directions, and we seem to be doing
No,
nothing.
in this particular case, I think, Vikram, what you must recognize is any action that you wish to take in, to use your term, punishment, could involve killing or causing a lot of misery to a number of innocent Tamils in that area, which you cannot afford to do because of that connotation.
But I am, of course,
distinction you have to make.
I am, of course, playing devil's advocate out here, and I'm not necessarily saying we should punish them today. I'm saying maybe it could have been done earlier at a stage in the past, especially when the IPK was there. But Raja,
But I think the fact is, look, doing nothing at this stage is not going to help, because the peace process in Sri Lanka is breaking down. In fact, what Balasingham's interview is a signal telling India that, look, you come on our side, because we're going to break this process, you better come on our side. The time has come for India now to pull all its cards together and say, look, how do I make sure that this process stays on course? What kind of pressures can I bring in LTTE, and what kind of incentives can I give? And the promise to talk is an incentive, but the threat that we will take you on if you don't behave should also be part of the package.
all right, I'm going to take a break at this point. Let's get the audience inside. What should India do with the LTTE, in Sri Lanka, with all of our neighbors? How far should we get involved? And as we were discussing right now, if the process involves sending troops to Afghanistan, then maybe to Iran, maybe to Iraq, is that part of what India is now willing to do as a responsible global power? We'll turn our attention to that as well when we come back. Time for the familiar snap polling, which I must again say is not necessarily scientific. First of all, you all heard what the LTTE had to say this week. How many people in this audience feel that India should deal with the LTTE in one way or the other, that India should engage with them? So I would say about half the audience feels that way. How many of you feel that it is part of India's responsibility now to take responsibility for its neighborhood, whether it is Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan? India will have to get involved in all these places. All right, just about all of you feel that way. Would you also therefore be comfortable in Indian troops being sent to fight, perhaps to die in places like Afghanistan? How many of you feel that? All right, so let's debate it. Why is it, if you are saying that India does have to get involved in all of our neighborhoods, then there will be the uncomfortable part of it, the necessity, for example, of sending troops there. You would not be comfortable with that.
We are not analyzing in depth as to what is the motives of the LTT to do this now. What is their compulsion and how far do they expect us to get involved? We must analyze that in depth and only
Raja, I
then
think you
we
pretty much
can
answered that.
make any decision.
I think, it's quite clear that both Colombo and the LTTE want us to be involved, preferably on their side. Now, if we don't get involved at all, the problem is the peace process is going to break down, and the consequences will be more refugees in Tamil Nadu, more tensions, and more violence, which is going to force you to...
The motivation for the LTT?
But you know, recently the European Union having declared them a terrorist organization, they are under severe pressure in terms of support, finances and things like that. So this could well be a ploy in order to try and wriggle out of the situation that they have now, brought themselves into.
All right.
Why do we think that sending troops is the only solution for India to take part in the peace process? We can encourage peace talks. Why aren't we doing that?
Very important.
I haven't seen the government reacting in the last 3 days. What are we sitting and doing? There's going to be no reaction at all. And I have a question to Mr. Singhvi as well. He seems to be taking a very aggressive stance. Right, at one point in time, he's saying there have to be preconditions laid down, saying LTT has to give up their claim for a separate country. Do you expect that to happen right in the first round of the talks, peace talks at all? At another stage, you're saying, it's an insult to the Indian government to take part in the peace process. So what is your stance at all? What do you think the government should be doing at all? There has been no clear stance coming out from you.
Firstly, as far as being an insult to the Indian nation, the Indian army is concerned, I said that about Mr. Balasingam's statement. Nothing to do with talks, number one. Number two, I am making a simple point. Talking with the LTT means India talks to the LTT directly. I am not agreeing on that today. Whether that may happen after 2 years, 3 years is different. What I am saying is that India must engage in solving problems in its neighborhood, including the Sri Lankan issue. It can engage into that by doing diplomacy, by exerting moral pressure on the Sri Lankan government, by supporting peace talks, by holding them, but not by talking necessarily at this stage to the LTTE directly. Number three, not to be a responsible superpower does not oblige you to be a rampaging Rambo. But equally, it doesn't mean that while your own country's laws...
Does it mean that you support rampaging Rambos?
No, I'm saying on the contrary.
Just on a slightly different...
You are
on a subject of a different big fight, does it mean you support them?
On the contrary, I'm opposing that. I'm saying a rampaging Rambo normally acts like a bull in a china shop. There's no reason why they should do that.
Sending the troops is really the last resort. Now, the whole lot of
I'm not saying sending troops to Sri Lanka in any case. I mean, the question will arise of sending them maybe to Afghanistan tomorrow. It could be sending them to, the next place of the crisis.
It should be the last resort, if at all.
If at all.
There's so many other methods.
But again, right, coming back to the broader question, if all of you are liking the concept or the idea of India playing a grander role out there on the world stage, I'm trying to ask whether all of you are willing to take what that might entail. It might entail us setting aside our domestic problems and actually spending time, money, effort, maybe human lives in solving other people's problems. Are you ready for it? Who wants to answer that?
In 1987, when we were engaged in IPKF operations, same discussions were done at every forum. India, superpower, hegemonious attitude. The LTT has not changed its stance. Sri Lankan government has not changed its stance. My question to Mr. Raja Mohan is, what is that new India can do now? Is it will repeat what they did before?
I think it's a very important question. I mean, I think the last time we tried to do this entirely on our own. We tried to keep everybody out, and they said, look, this is in our backyard, only India must do the conflict resolution. Now, this time, since 2000, willy-nilly, we've let the Norwegians do the political process. That's not really worked. Now, what we need to do at this time differently is build an international coalition that is led by India and not doing it alone. And see, look, there is going to be no great power status without on the cheap. But there's a right way of doing great power status, that is in cooperation with the international community, mobilize the resources and capabilities so that we discipline both the factions of the fight and say, look, this is the right way to go, and if we go the wrong way, the weight of the entire international system will come down on both the feet.
Time for us to take another break. Final comments from all our panelists when we come back. To the big fight in the week when Anton Balasingham made some rather interesting remarks to NDTV. What should India do now with the LTT, with Sri Lanka in general, and with its neighbors in an even more general sense? Final comments now from all of our panelists in this, the final countdown. All right, Mr. Raman, let me get you in first. Final comments, 30 seconds from all panelists. What do you think India's stance should now be in Sri Lanka?
So one of the problems which we are facing is because people in Delhi, most of them being from the north, they don't understand the Tamil, whether a Tamil of Sri Lanka or a Tamil of Tamil Nadu. We were all amazed in Tamil Nadu at the way you all danced, sang and danced, that Balasingham has offered an apology. It was a tongue-in-the-cheek apology. We're all starting on the presumption that LTT has apologized. It has not apologized. It has not admitted its responsibility for the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. That's the first point which I want to make. Number two, there is no, you said that Americans went and intervened in Afghanistan. Have they succeeded? Have they succeeded in Iraq? Going intervening in Sri Lanka is not the option. We have to destroy the terrorism capability of the LTTE, which poses a threat to us. Its maritime terrorism capability poses a threat to us. Its air terrorism capability poses a threat to us. We have to examine how to deal with the capability, how to destroy the capability. At the same time, we have a responsibility as a neighbor to see that the aspirations of the Tamils of Sri Lanka are adequately met by the government. So we must have a multi-pronged policy, and we must deal with that policy on the basis of focused, cool discussion and not on the basis of Hyde Park or rhetoric.
All right, sir. Valid points, Mr. Nambiar.
I would only say this, that insofar as the LTT is concerned, if the government of Sri Lanka feels it appropriate to or find it possible to resume the peace process, we should certainly encourage them, and in that process, to the extent that they wish us to be involved, we should have no reservations about doing so. I don't think this question of sending troops comes in at this point in time at all.
So that's a more generic point to do with
in fact, it's also, I'd like to very briefly make this point when you ask this question of the audience about, everything, India must play a role, it must participate. Should we send troops somewhere? Everyone has a thumbs down signal. Have the cake and eat it. There are certain situations in which it needs to be done, and I'm saying this as a former service officer whose son is in the army. Should it be necessary, we should take these decisions, but those should be well considered decisions.
All right, Raja.
I think the problem is not that Delhi does not understand Tamil Nadu. In fact, the last two governments, both of the NDA government and the UPA government, are beholden to Tamil parties. So that is the reality. I think they understand the Tamil Nadu situation a bit too much, and I think that is part of the problem. What India needs to do now is, if the situation is going to blow in our face, it's a question of time. We must get involved. Military, we're not talking about military involvement. We're talking about getting involved in a diplomatic, political engagement with all the parties in Sri Lanka and with the international community to make sure that the peace process remains on track for the moment.
Right. Abhishek Singhvi, final question to you before you make your final comment. Will essentially any decision that you take, will it be basically dictated by your allies from Tamil Nadu?
Oh, not at all. In matters of foreign policy,
you
there's
say
no
that
question
with your hand on your heart.
No, of course. For matters of foreign policy have always stood on a different footing. There's not a question. You will take input from everyone, but to say that dictated by any one party is totally wrong. That's been the consistent course of Indian foreign policy. But I want to say this, there are three levels of this discussion: LTT, Sri Lanka and our larger neighborhood. The three are different. You can't apply similar identical standards to all three. As far as the LTT is concerned, I am glad that Mr. Raman drew applause, because I take that as an endorsement and acceptance of what I said earlier. The LTT's so-called apology is a sham, it's a farce. Wait for them to show sincerity and genuineness for a few months and then react. As far as engaging Sri Lanka is concerned, as far as trying to solve problems in Bangladesh and Nepal is concerned, of course, we are morally, diplomatically and otherwise committed to do that.
It might take to do
of course.
That.
Yes.
All right, fine. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for having joined us on The Big Fight. That's it for this week. Do join us again next week. Same time, same place.